Hello, my friend. Today I will tell you another long-forgotten legend. Close your eyes and let the magic transport you to Middle-earth. Our journey begins.
In the heart of the western lands of Middle-earth stood the ancient valley of Nan Curunir, the Vale of the Wizard. At its center rose Orthanc, a black tower wrought by forgotten hands in the elder days, its stone gleaming dark as obsidian and harder than iron. Long had it stood, unbroken by time, its four pinnacles piercing the sky. To this fortress Saruman the White had come, master of Isengard and head of the Order of Wizards. Once he was deemed the wisest of all, chosen by the Valar to stand against the shadow that grew once more in the east. But wisdom, when mingled with pride, may twist into peril. Saruman, while cloaked in the robes of white, had begun to tread a darker road. The ring of power, long thought lost, had returned to whisper in the councils of the great. Though unseen, its shadow stretched over all. In secret, Saruman delved into the arts of lore forbidden, studying the devices of Sauron and bending his mind to thoughts of mastery. For he believed the fate of Middle-earth should be ruled by strength and cunning, and who better than himself to bear that burden? It was in these days that Gandalf the Grey, his brother in the Order, journeyed to Isengard. The two had once stood together upon the White Council, resisting the will of the enemy. Yet Gandalf's heart was troubled, for whispers reached him of strange doings in the Vale of Isengard. Forests fell to axe and fire. Men in dark livery rode abroad, spying upon the lands of Rohan. And some said that Saruman the White no longer robed himself in white alone, but in many hues, as though the purity of his order had been broken. When Gandalf came before Orthanc, Saruman greeted him with courtesy, though beneath his voice lay an edge as sharp as steel. They climbed the long stair into the tower, and in its high chamber Saruman spoke of power, of the One Ring, and of the rising of the Dark Lord. He urged Gandalf to join him, saying that the hour of decision was at hand. "Why," said Saruman, "should we not take the ring and wield it against him? Who is the Dark Lord that we should serve him when we may master him instead? For I am Saruman the Wise, Saruman of many colors." Then Gandalf knew the truth. Saruman had betrayed them all, for his heart was turned to power. And when Gandalf refused his offer, choosing still to stand against Sauron in humility, Saruman's face grew dark as a storm. "So you have chosen," he said, and he lifted his staff. Gandalf was seized, and Saruman cast him into the pinnacle of Orthanc, high above the vale. There, alone upon the stone, Gandalf was held prisoner, watched by spies and servants of Saruman. Yet the Grey Wizard's spirit was not broken. Day after day he walked the cold summit, gazing out over the world beyond. He beheld the smoke rising from the furnaces below, where Saruman's servants hewed down the trees of Fangorn to feed their fires. He saw pits opened in the earth, where black forges burned, and the hammer rang night and day. Strange warriors moved among them, taller and stronger than any orc, yet more disciplined and cunning. These were Saruman's new creatures, the Uruk-hai, bred to war, and they bore the white hand of their master. Thus was Gandalf made witness to the betrayal of Isengard, but he was not left without hope. For even in his captivity he remembered that the great eagles still dwelt in the northern mountains, guardians of old who had borne tidings to the free peoples in times of need. Patiently, he waited, biding his hour. And when at last Gwaihir the Wind Lord came upon swift wings, the bonds of Orthanc were broken. Gandalf was lifted from the high pinnacle, and together they sped across the leagues of Middle-earth, leaving behind the darkening veil of Nan Curunir. Below, Saruman's treachery deepened. He called to him wild men out of Dunland, promising them plunder and land if they would rise against Rohan.
He drove his orcs into the mountains, setting ambushes on the roads. He scoured the plains with spies, hunting for any sign of the ring. And in the depths of Isengard, his smiths toiled unceasing, forging weapons, shields, and iron engines of war. So it was that the land of Isengard, once fair and green, became a prison of smoke and flame. The trees of Fangorn fell in countless numbers, their trunks dragged into the pits, their voices silenced. But the Ents, the ancient shepherds of the forest, stirred in secret wrath. For though they were slow to anger, their grief was heavy, and their vengeance would be long in coming. Thus the stage was set. Saruman, once the White, had turned his back upon the wisdom of his order. The Grey Wizard had escaped to rally the free peoples, and deep in the wild the Ents began to watch, their eyes kindling like coals in the night. The first moves of betrayal were played, and Middle-earth stood on the edge of war. The Vale of Isengard was no longer a place of peace. Smoke rose day and night from the furnaces that Saruman had ordered built, staining the sky with dark clouds that drifted far across the plains of Rohan. Where once a clear river had run, its waters now grew fouled, clogged with ash and oily blackness. The grasslands were trampled under the boots of orcs and wild men, and the cries of axes echoed from dawn to dusk as Fangorn's trees fell in unending ruin. Saruman walked often upon the great ring wall that encircled Orthanc, looking down at his growing army. His voice carried far, sharp, and commanding, and no one dared disobey. He had taken the white hand as his sign, painting it upon shields, banners, and armor, so that all who fought for him bore his mark. The valley became a prison of industry, filled with the pounding of hammers, the glare of forge fires, and the roar of furnaces. Yet Saruman was not content with armies of orcs alone. Deep within his pits, he had bred a new race, larger and more dreadful, the Uruk-hai. Unlike the orcs of Mordor, they could endure the light of the sun, and they were stronger and swifter. They carried great bows and straight swords, and their discipline was greater than any of their kind before. These soldiers he set apart, training them in secrecy, knowing they would be the spearhead of his war against Rohan, and, if fate permitted, against all Middle-earth. Meanwhile, word of Saruman's betrayal spread slowly. Gandalf, freed by Gwaihir, rode in haste across the lands, but his message was grim and the days were short. Rohan was the first to feel the weight of Isengard's hand. Villages upon the western borders were harried by raiders, their people slain or taken captive. The riders of the Mark pursued these foes, but the enemy was many, and their numbers grew each passing week. Saruman had not only sent his orcs, but had stirred the Dunlendings, wild men long at feud with Rohan. With promises of land and revenge, he bound them to his service. King Theoden of Rohan, however, did not yet see the full peril, for Saruman's agents had found ways to worm their influence into the very halls of Meduseld, the Golden Hall of Adoras. Wormtongue was his name, though in the king's court he was called Grima, a counselor most trusted. With whispered words he poisoned the king's ear, urging delay, speaking of fear, and draining Theoden's strength day by day.
By such treachery, Saruman hoped to weaken Rohan before his army struck, but the land itself began to stir against him. In Fangorn Forest, where ancient trees stood older than kingdoms, the Ents watched with slow wrath. Their hearts were heavy with sorrow as they felt the pain of the fallen trees. Though the Ents were creatures of patience, seldom roused to haste or anger, even they could not endure endless destruction. Treebeard, the eldest and greatest of them all, spoke little, but in his heart he felt a storm brewing. One evening, Saruman stood upon the high balcony of Orthanc, gazing toward the east. In his hand he held a palantir, one of the seeing stones of old. Through it he sought knowledge, hoping to bend it to his will. But the stone was perilous, for in the east Sauron also held one, and the will of the Dark Lord was strong. There, in the deep of night, Saruman parleyed in secret. He cloaked his words in cunning, but whether he sought to deceive Sauron or had already become his servant, none could say. From that hour, however, his path turned ever darker, and his schemes grew bolder. In the days that followed, Saruman ordered a great host to be prepared. Orcs poured forth from the pits, bearing cruel spears and jagged blades. The Uruk-hai marched in companies, their shields black with the white hand. Dunlending tribes gathered in the vale, shouting their cries of war. Slowly, the valley of Isengard transformed into a fortress of iron, an anvil upon which Saruman meant to shape the fate of Middle-earth. But Gandalf was not idle. After his escape, he sought out the rulers of the free peoples, warning them of Saruman's treachery. He urged King Theoden to resist, though the king's will was clouded by Wormtongue's deceit. He spoke with Elrond and with Aragorn, telling them of Saruman's betrayal and of the danger now upon them. And always he looked to the ring-bearer, Frodo, though his path was hidden and perilous. For Gandalf knew that Saruman's hunger for the ring might yet undo them all. Still the storm gathered. Saruman's armies grew restless, eager for war. Scouts returned with tidings of weakness in Rohan's defenses, and Saruman's pride swelled. "The horse lords are but grass before the scythe," he said to his captains. "With one stroke we shall sweep them from the plains." His voice, once a balm to many, had become hard and cruel. None dared oppose him, for his wrath was quick, and his power greater than ever before. And so the betrayal of Isengard deepened. Saruman, who once walked among the wise, now plotted to bring down kingdoms.
His hand reached into Rohan, his shadow fell upon Fangorn, and his eyes turned ever toward the One Ring. But the tale of treachery had only begun, for beyond his walls, forces stirred that even the White Wizard had not reckoned with. Far away from Isengard's choking smoke, the wide plains of Rohan stretched golden beneath the sun. The grass rippled like the sea, stirred by winds that carried the scent of horses and earth. This was the realm of the Horse Lords, a proud people who had long guarded the West from the powers of darkness. But now fear was beginning to take root even here, for rumors of raids and strange shadows spread from village to village. At the Golden Hall of Meduseld in Edoras, King Theoden sat upon his high seat. Once a mighty warrior, beloved of his people, he had grown bent and weary, as if his years had doubled. His hair was white as snow, and his eyes were clouded, though he was not so old as he appeared. By his side, ever whispering, stood Grima, his pale-faced counselor. Wormtongue spoke softly, but his words were heavy with venom. Each day he urged caution, warning Theoden against action, feeding his fears until the king's will was almost broken.
Omer, nephew of the king, burned with anger at this corruption. Tall, strong, and loyal to Rohan, he rode tirelessly with the riders of the Mark, chasing down raiding parties that harried their borders. Many times he returned to Meduseld with news of villages burned, families slain, and the tracks of orcs leading back toward the north. Yet when he spoke, Wormtongue twisted his words, accusing him of rashness, of recklessness, even of plotting against his king. Theoden, clouded and weakened, began to doubt his own kin. Meanwhile, Saruman's hand grew bolder. In the shadows of the night, orcs and wild men poured across the gap of Rohan, torching homesteads and stealing cattle. Travelers upon the roads vanished, and smoke rose from lonely farmsteads. Still, Wormtongue whispered, "It is but small trouble, my lord. The mark is wide, and such things are always to be expected. Do not waste your strength in open war. Let the storm pass." And Theoden listened, his shoulders sinking while his people despaired. But Gandalf had not forgotten Rohan, clad now in white, for he had been sent back. With greater power after his battle with the Balrog, he rode across the plains with speed unmatched. Shadowfax bore him, the greatest of all horses, swift as the wind, and wherever he passed, men turned their heads, for a gleam of light seemed to follow him. When at last he came to Meduseld, the guards barred his way at Wormtongue's command, but Gandalf's voice rang like a trumpet. "I come to speak with the king, and none shall hinder me." His eyes blazed, and even the proudest of men faltered. Inside the hall, the air was heavy with gloom. The fire burned low, and the king sat hunched, his crown askew, his gaze distant. Wormtongue slithered forward, hissing against Gandalf's entry, but Gandalf strode into the hall, staff in hand, and his voice thundered, "Theoden King, too long have you sat in shadow. Hearken to me. Rise and remember your strength." Then it seemed a light filled the hall, and the darkness fell away. Theoden's eyes cleared, his back straightened, and a great weariness lifted from him. With trembling hand he cast aside his staff and rose to his feet. "Dark have been my dreams," he said, "but now I awake." His gaze fell upon Wormtongue, and wrath kindled in his heart. "Your counsel is poison. Be gone from my sight, or I will have you flung from the gates." Wormtongue shrank back, his pale skin clammy with fear. He begged for pardon, but none listened. At Gandalf's urging, he was driven from the hall, fleeing into the shadows beyond. Some said he returned straight to Isengard, bearing tidings to Saruman, though others claimed he lingered for a time, plotting revenge. Whatever the truth, his treachery was laid bare, and Theoden was freed. With his strength renewed, Theoden turned at once to the defense of his realm. He called for his riders, summoning them from all corners of the Mark. The great horns of Edoras were blown, echoing across the hills, and men came in haste, bringing their horses, their spears, and their courage. For the first time in many months, hope stirred in the hearts of the Rohirrim. But Saruman was swift. Even as Theoden gathered his strength, hosts of orcs and wild men poured southward, villages fell, and refugees streamed toward Edoras. The roads were choked with fear, and tales of monstrous soldiers spread, for the Uruk-hai had come forth, bearing their straight swords and iron armor, moving with dreadful speed. They left no survivors when they struck, and their cruelty was such that even hardened warriors trembled to face them. It was then that Gandalf counseled the king to lead his people to Helm's Deep, a fortress long thought unassailable. Theoden agreed, and the great journey began. From Edoras, the riders led their people, men, women, and children, across the plains, while scouts and horsemen guarded the flanks. The sky was dark, and the wind carried the smell of smoke, for behind them Saruman's army was on the march. In the deepening gloom, Theoden looked upon his people and felt the weight of his duty. His realm was burning, his people hunted, and the storm was at hand. Yet beside him rode Gandalf, tall and stern, a beacon of strength. "Do not fear," said Gandalf. "Hope yet remains, but I must ride ahead. Look for me at dawn." And with that he spurred Shadowfax and vanished into the night, swift as lightning. So the people of Rohan fled toward Helm's Deep, while behind them the sound of drums and the tramp of countless feet shook the earth. Saruman had loosed his hand at last, and war came to Rohan like a thunderstorm, breaking over the plains. The fortress of Helm's Deep, carved into the White Mountains, had long been a place of refuge in times of war. Its walls rose sheer from the cliffs, built by the men of Númenor in ages past. At its heart stood the Hornburg, a tower strong and proud, and before it stretched the deeping wall, high and unbroken, guarding the narrow gorge known as Helm's Dyke. No army had ever breached its defenses, and yet, as the people of Rohan streamed into its shelter, fear followed close upon them, for behind them came the greatest army Saruman had ever sent forth. The road to Helm's Deep was filled with weary faces. Women carried children, men bore their few possessions, and farmers drove their cattle in desperate haste. The riders of Rohan formed a protective ring around the host, their spears gleaming even in the twilight. Overhead, the sky grew heavy with storm clouds, as if the very heavens mourned the peril that was descending. King Theoden rode among his people, his voice steady, though his heart was heavy. He offered words of courage where he could, clasping the hands of those who faltered. Yet even as he spoke, he could see the glow of fire in the distance, for Saruman's forces left burning trails across the plains. The world seemed to shrink around them, pressing the last strength of Rohan into the stone embrace of Helm's Deep. At last, they reached the fortress, and the people poured inside, filling the great caverns behind the walls. The guards barred the gates and made ready for war. Éomer rode along the battlements, calling to his riders, setting them in their posts. Arrows were stacked, spears sharpened, and cauldrons of stone prepared to hurl down upon the enemy. All knew that a storm was coming, greater than any they had faced before. As night fell, a dreadful silence settled over the valley. Then, faint at first, but growing louder, came the sound of drums. The ground trembled with the tread of countless feet. Torches flared in the darkness, and a sea of black shapes appeared beyond the dike. Orcs poured across the plain, their guttural voices rising in harsh cries. Beside them marched the wild men of Dunland, waving clubs and axes, their banners showing the white hand of Saruman. And at the front strode the Uruk-hai, clad in heavy mail, shields locked in tight formation, their eyes gleaming like coals. Theoden stood upon the wall, his sword unsheathed. His voice carried over the fortress, now for wrath, now for ruin, and a red dawn. A great cheer rose from the men of Rohan, though their hearts beat fast with dread. They gripped their spears, waiting for the clash to come. The storm broke with a roar. Arrows whistled from the walls, striking orcs and men alike. The enemy surged forward, hurling ladders against the stone, battering the gates with rams and loosing their own volleys in return. The deeping wall shuddered under the assault, but the riders held firm. Stones rained down upon the foe, shattering shields and skulls. Again and again the orcs tried to climb, but each time they were thrown back with sword and spear. Yet Saruman had prepared well. Among his host were strange devices never before seen in Rohan, long spears of fire crafted in the forges of Isengard. With these the Uruk-hai struck at the wall's base, planting them deep into cracks. Then a terrible explosion shook the night as flame burst forth, tearing a great hole in the deeping wall. Smoke and fire filled the air, and through the breach poured the enemy, roaring with triumph. The battle raged through the night. In the deeping coombe, where the breach had opened, the men of Rohan fought desperately to hold the line. Eomer led charge after charge, his sword flashing, cutting down foes on every side. Theoden himself fought in the thick of battle, his voice rising above the din, rallying his men. Yet for every enemy they struck down, two more seemed to take its place. High above, arrows rained ceaselessly, but the host of Saruman was vast, and their numbers unending. The wild men of Dunland hurled themselves against the gates with reckless fury, while the Uruk-hai advanced in grim silence, their shields locked like a wall of iron. The defenders grew weary, their arms heavy, their spirits stretched thin. All through the night, the fortress echoed with the clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, and the thunder of rams upon wood and stone. Still hope endured, for Theoden remembered Gandalf's words, "Look for me at dawn." As the night dragged on and the shadow deepened, he clung to that promise, even as doubt gnawed at him. Where was the gray pilgrim now turned white? Would he return, or had he ridden into doom? At the darkest hour before dawn, when even the bravest faltered, the gates of Helm's Deep groaned beneath the blows of a mighty ram. Splinters flew, hinges shrieked, and the iron-banded wood began to crack. The defenders braced themselves, knowing the end was near. And then, as the first pale light touched the eastern sky, a horn sounded upon the heights. It was no orc horn, but the deep, clear note of the horn of Helm Hammerhand, echoing through the valley. The sound rolled like thunder, shaking the walls and filling every heart with sudden fire. Theoden lifted his sword, crying, to me, riders of Rohan." And with that he led a charge from the fortress, bursting through the gates in a blaze of steel. The enemy reeled back in surprise, but they were many, and the tide was against the Rohirrim. Yet even as hope wavered, there came a second sound, the thunder of hooves upon the ridge. There, upon the crest, stood Gandalf the White, shining like the dawn itself. Beside him rode Erkenbrand, Lord of the Westfold, and behind them stretched a host of riders, their spears gleaming. The sun broke suddenly over the horizon, and its light fell full upon the valley. With a cry that shook the mountains, Gandalf raised his hand, and the riders charged. Down they came, swift as the wind, their horses thundering, their voices raised in a mighty shout. The orcs faltered, blinded by the sudden light, and the wild men quailed. The riders swept into their ranks like a storm, scattering them in terror. The host of Saruman, once so mighty, broke beneath the onslaught, fleeing in chaos toward the plain. The battle was won. Helm's Deep still stood, though its walls were scarred and its defenders weary. But as the sun rose higher, all knew that the war was not yet ended, for this was but the first blow in the great betrayal of Saruman, and his fortress of Isengard still loomed, filled with fire and iron, awaiting its reckoning. The cries of victory still echoed in the valley of Helm's Deep when Gandalf turned his gaze northward. Though the host of Saruman had been scattered and broken, the White Wizard's power was not yet spent. In the fortress of Isengard, his forges burned without pause, and the Uruk-hai were countless. Unless his stronghold was silenced, war would return to Rohan again and again until no hope remained. Yet fate had already begun to weave another thread in the story of Saruman's betrayal. For in the depths of Fangorn Forest, far from the fields of battle, the oldest of living things stirred. The forest was a place of shadow and mystery, where ancient trees towered skyward and the air was filled with the sound of rustling leaves and whispering boughs. Few dared to wander there, for the wood was dark and its paths seemed to shift and vanish, but hidden within those groves dwelt the Ents, shepherds of the forest, guardians of the trees. They were tall as hills, with bark-like skin and eyes that gleamed like pools of water in the starlight. The greatest of them was Fangorn, whom men called Treebeard. He had walked beneath the sun and moon since the world was young, and in his memory lay countless ages. Slow to speak, slow to anger, the Ents seldom concerned themselves with the doings of men and elves, but the cries of the forest could not be ignored, for Saruman's axes had bitten deep into Fangorn. The pain of the trees was like a wound in their own hearts, and their sorrow was turning into wrath. It was in those days that Merry and Pippin, the hobbits of the Shire, came into Fangorn. They had fled from the Uruk-hai after the great battle upon the plains, slipping away into the shadows of the wood. Weary and uncertain, they stumbled upon Treebeard himself, and though they were afraid at first, his voice was gentle, deep, and full of ancient wisdom. To him they told their tale, how Saruman had captured them, how he sought the ring, and how his armies were laying waste to the lands. Treebeard listened in silence, his eyes narrowing like storm clouds gathering. Long he pondered, for Ents were not hasty folk. But at last he said, "This Saruman, he has a mind of metal and wheels, and he does not care for growing things. He is a danger to all of us. I will not stand by while my forest is hewn down." And so Treebeard summoned the Entmoot, the gathering of all his kind. From every corner of Fangorn they came, huge, looming figures with creaking limbs and booming voices. They met in the great clearing where the light of the sun fell through the canopy, and there they spoke together in their slow, rumbling tongue. The hobbits watched anxiously, for the Ents took their time with all things, and their counsel stretched on as the hours passed. At first it seemed they would do nothing. Some were weary of war, others doubted that Saruman's schemes concerned them. But Treebeard's grief was deep, and the hobbit's words weighed heavily upon him. At last he rose to his full height, his voice thundering like a storm. "Enough! The axe bites too deep. Saruman has crossed the line."
This war is ours now, to Isengard. A great shout rose from the Ents, like the crash of waves upon rock. Their eyes glowed with sudden fire, and their limbs trembled with wrath. For the first time in many ages, the Ents were roused to war. That very day they marched. The ground shook beneath their strides as they advanced from the forest, a host of living trees, towering and terrible. Birds fled from their path, and even the wild creatures of the wood hid in fear. Merry and Pippin rode upon Treebeard's shoulders, clinging tight as they passed out of the forest into the open lands before Isengard. The sight was terrible to behold.
Where once had been a green valley, there was now a barren pit. The trees were gone, cut down to stumps and ashes. Black smoke poured from chimneys, and the air reeked of burning coal. The river was dammed, its waters turned to drive the wheels of Saruman's machines. Deep pits yawned where once grass had grown, and in them labored orcs and slaves, forging weapons and iron engines of war. When the Ents beheld this ruin, their wrath knew no bounds. With a thunderous cry, they stormed the ring wall of Isengard. Their hands, like great roots, tore stone from stone. Gates splintered beneath their fists. Towers trembled and fell. Orcs poured forth shrieking, but they were crushed beneath the feet of the Ents, or swept aside like leaves in the wind. Treebeard himself strode to the gates of Orthanc, bellowing in fury. His arms swung like mighty hammers, shattering walls and scattering foes. The ground was torn open, and the very earth seemed to rise against Saruman's fortress. From every side the Ents pressed in, breaking dams, tearing down engines, and flooding the pits with the waters of the river. Within Orthanc, Saruman looked out from his high window and beheld the ruin of all his works. His forges were drowned, his armies scattered, his valley consumed by flood and fire. His pride turned to terror, and for the first time in many years, he felt the bite of fear. He shut himself within the tower, calling upon his arts to keep the Ents at bay. But though Orthanc itself stood unbroken, for no power of Ent or man could shatter its ancient stone, the land around it was utterly destroyed. By the time night fell, Isengard was no longer a fortress, but a ruin. The waters roared through its pits, washing away the filth and quenching the fires. The trees could not be restored, but the works of Saruman were undone. The White Hand was broken, and his might was shattered. Yet the tale was not finished, for Saruman still lived, caged within his black tower. His voice was strong, his cunning undiminished, and even now he plotted how he might twist defeat into another snare. The betrayal of Isengard was not yet ended, though the tide had turned against him. Merry and Pippin looked upon the ruins with wonder, for they had witnessed the wrath of the Ents. Slow to anger, but terrible when roused. And as they sat among the wreckage, their hearts lifted with hope. For though the road ahead was still dark, one of the greatest threats to the free peoples had been struck a heavy blow. The dawn after the storm of the Ents rose pale and cold over the valley of Isengard. Smoke drifted in tatters, mingling with mist, and the waters of the river rushed through the broken dams, swirling about the ruins of forges and pits. The proud fortress was no more, save only the black tower of Orthanc, which stood unshaken in the midst of desolation. Its 4 sharp pinnacles gleamed darkly in the new light, proud and untouchable, as though mocking all the ruin around it. Merry and Pippin were the first of the free folk to behold this strange aftermath. They sat together on the edge of a toppled wall, legs dangling over the flood, their faces pale, but their eyes bright with amazement.
"Well," said Merry, brushing a smudge of ash from his sleeve, "if this is what Ents can do when they lose their tempers, I am glad we are on their side." Pippin laughed nervously, though he still glanced toward Orthanc with unease. "Yes, but what about him? He's still in there, isn't he? Safe and sound in that awful tower. I don't like the thought of him looking out at us. Feels as though he could reach through the window and pluck us up like sparrows." Treebeard stood near, his vast shape like a living pillar among the wreckage. His great eyes glimmered deep with sorrow and anger. "Whom
Hroom. He is still within, yes. Orthanc is stronger than stone. No axe can bite it, no root can shake it, but he is caged. Saruman of many colors. Let him look out and see what has come of his works. His machines are drowned, his pits are filled, and his army is scattered. The land has spoken against him, and we have answered. As the hobbits listened, the sound of horns drifted faintly through the mist. They leapt to their feet, for the note was no orc call, but clear and proud, the horns of Rohan. Across the plain, banners came into sight, green upon white, fluttering in the morning breeze. Riders approached, their horses swift and strong, and at their head rode Gandalf the White. Upon Shadowfax, with King Theoden beside him, golden helm shining. Eomer followed close, his spear raised high, and behind them came the riders who had survived Helm's Deep. Weary but unbroken, the sight stirred the hobbits' hearts. They ran to the gates, or rather what was left of them, and waved their arms. "Gandalf, over here," Pippin shouted, his voice carrying clear in the fresh morning air. The riders reined in at the edge of the flood, gazing with wonder at the ruin of Isengard. Theoden's eyes widened as he beheld the shattered walls and the waters surging where once stood Saruman's forges. "By the Valar," he murmured, "what power has done this? Not even all the riders of the Mark could have wrought such ruin." Gandalf's gaze turned to Treebeard, who stood tall and unyielding among the wreckage. "It was not men who broke Isengard," he said. "It was the anger of the Ents, long delayed. Saruman's evil has cut too deep, and now the forest itself has risen against him." Theoden bowed his head, awe in his eyes. "Then the world is stranger than I thought, and hope may yet be found where least expected." At that moment, Merry and Pippin came running, their faces bright despite the soot and grime upon them. "We're all right," cried Pippin, nearly tripping as he scrambled up the slope. "Not even a scratch. Well, not a serious one. Merry's cloak got a little singed, but otherwise we're fine." The king stared at them in amazement. "Hobbits! By the stars, Gandalf, your tales grow ever stranger. How came these small folk to be here, in the midst of such ruin?" Gandalf only smiled. "That is a long tale, Theoden King, and one for later. For now, know only that these are stout-hearted companions, and fortune has placed them where they were needed most." Treebeard stepped forward, his shadow falling long across the company. "Saruman is within his tower," he rumbled, "and he cannot escape. But I warn you, do not underestimate his voice. It is dangerous, more dangerous than swords or spears. He has beguiled many with his words, twisting their hearts to his will. Beware lest you be ensnared. Then we will face him," said Gandalf gravely. His eyes gleamed, cold and bright. "It is time that Saruman be brought to account." So they advanced toward Orthanc, the riders arrayed before the Black Tower. The Ents stood behind, silent and grim, their presence like a forest waiting to strike. The waters rushed about the base of Orthanc, but the tower itself loomed untouched, dark as midnight. From a high window, Saruman appeared at last. His robes gleamed white as snow in the sunlight, and his hair shone like silver. To those who looked upon him, he seemed still a lord of great majesty, his voice smooth as silk when he spoke. "King Theoden," he called, his tone warm, almost fatherly. "Brave riders of Rohan, how glad I am to see you alive after such grievous battle. I weep for your losses, and I grieve that ill counsel has brought you here to lay waste to what might have been a strong ally. For Isengard was ever a friend to Rohan. Why now do you turn against me?" The riders shifted uneasily, for Saruman's voice was full of honeyed sorrow, and it was easy to believe him. Some even looked at Theoden, doubt stirring in their hearts. But Gandalf stood firm, his staff in hand. "You dare to speak of friendship," Gandalf replied, his voice ringing like steel. "When your armies have ravaged the Westfold, when your lies have poisoned the house of Meduseld, when your forges have devoured Fangorn, you betrayed us all, Saruman. Your words are nothing but poison." Saruman's eyes narrowed, though his smile did not fade. "Ah, Gandalf the Grey. No, Gandalf the White now, so I hear. You come robed in light, but are you not still the same meddler, blind to wisdom? I do not serve Sauron. I would master him. Together we might yet wield the ring and bend the world to peace. Why do you always refuse the better path?" The riders murmured among themselves, caught between the wizard's smooth persuasion and Gandalf's stern rebuke. But Theoden stepped forward, his voice ringing clear. "Your friendship is death, Saruman. You promised us safety, but brought us only ruin. The White Hand has drenched our fields in blood. No more shall Rohan heed your voice." For the first time, Saruman's mask faltered. Anger flickered in his eyes, and his voice grew sharp. "So be it. Rohan shall burn, and you with it. When the hosts of Mordor march, you will cry for my help, and I will not answer." But Gandalf raised his hand, and a great light seemed to shine from his staff. His voice thundered like a storm. "Saruman, your power is ended. Come down from your tower and surrender your staff. No longer are you head of the order, nor wise among the council. I cast you from the fellowship of the Istari." The words struck like a blow. Saruman staggered back, his staff leaping from his hand and shattering upon the stones below. A cry escaped his lips. Filled with rage and despair, he vanished from the window, and the watchers below knew that his pride had been broken. For a long while there was silence. The waters rushed about the base of Orthanc. The wind stirred the ruined valley, and the company stood in awe. Then Gandalf lowered his staff, his face weary but resolute. "Thus ends Saruman's power, but his malice remains, and it will trouble us still. We must watch, for even a broken snake can strike." Treebeard bowed his great head. "He shall not escape. We will guard him, he and his servant both. Orthanc shall be his prison until the world decides his fate." So it was agreed. Saruman was left to brood in his tower, a prisoner of his own pride, while the free peoples turned their thoughts to the greater war that loomed in the east. Yet none doubted that his treachery was not wholly ended. A shadow remained in Orthanc, biding its time, waiting for a chance to strike again, and so the betrayal of Isengard passed into a new chapter, the power of Saruman broken, but his schemes far from finished. The waters of Isengard lapped quietly around the base of Orthanc, but within the Black Tower, all was turmoil. Saruman, once the proud leader of the White Council, sat hunched in shadow, his face pale with rage. The shattering of his staff had struck him like a mortal wound. His voice, once able to sway kings and councils, had been cast aside by Gandalf's command, and the echoes of those dreadful words, "I cast you from the order," still burned in his mind like fire. He was not alone. In the darkened hall nearby crept Grima Wormtongue, pale and trembling, his eyes darting like a rat in a trap. He had been driven from Meduseld in disgrace, spat upon by the riders of Rohan, and now his only refuge was in the service of Saruman. Yet that service was bitter, for Saruman's wrath was fierce, and Wormtongue lived in constant fear of his master's temper. Saruman paced the floor, his robes of many colors shimmering faintly in the dim light. "Fools," he hissed, striking the air with his hand. "All fools! Theoden, Gandalf, even those forest walkers who dare to lay hand upon my works. They think me broken, but they do not know me. No prison can hold Saruman the Wise." Wormtongue flinched. "But my lord, they guard the tower. The Ents stand watch day and night, and the riders will not leave you unmarked. How shall we escape such eyes?" Saruman turned, his gaze sharp as a blade. "Silence, you crawling worm. Have you learned nothing? Walls and guards mean little when one has knowledge. There are ways yet. There are allies yet. Did you think the Dark Lord no longer watches? Did you think his hand would not reach even here?" Wormtongue swallowed hard but dared not reply, for indeed, in the uppermost chamber of Orthanc, behind a door locked to all but Saruman, lay a treasure of great peril, the Palantir, the Seeing Stone. With it, Saruman had gazed across leagues, learning the mind of Sauron and plotting his own rise to power. It had been both his greatest tool and his deepest downfall, for the Eye of Mordor had caught him, drawing him into its net. Still, even broken in pride, Saruman clung to it, whispering in the dark, trying to weave new schemes through the stone's terrible power. Meanwhile, outside the tower, life stirred in strange ways. Merry and Pippin, delighted to be alive, had quickly made themselves at home in the wreckage of Isengard. They discovered the stores of Saruman's larders, great piles of salted meats, barrels of ale, and baskets of dried fruit. Never had hobbits been so fortunate in such unlikely surroundings. They filled their bellies, sang songs, and watched with wide eyes as the Ents went about their work. "Not bad, eh?" said Pippin, leaning back against a cask of ale, his face ruddy with contentment. "If every battle ends with food like this, I might not mind war so much after all." Merry frowned, though his eyes twinkled. "Don't say such things, Pip. War's a nasty business, and we've only been lucky so far. Still," he looked around at the piles of treasure, silver trinkets, bolts of fine cloth, and strange tools lying abandoned. "I must admit we've landed on our feet here. Who would have thought Saruman, of all people, would keep such comforts?" They laughed, but their laughter carried uneasily into the night, for Orthanc loomed above them like a dark finger stabbing at the sky. It was not long before the great lords of Rohan and Gondor, Gandalf, Theoden, Éomer, came together in council beneath the walls of Orthanc. Treebeard joined them, his vast bulk towering over man and horse alike, his voice slow and steady. "Saruman is caged," rumbled the Ent. "We will keep him here, and none shall pass in or out without my knowing. Yet we cannot undo him. Orthanc is too strong, and no Ent can break it." "Nor should you try," said Gandalf. His face was grave, his white robes catching the light. "The stone of this tower was wrought in the elder days by hands stronger than ours. It will not fall by force of any here. Saruman's prison must be his pride. Let him look out upon the ruin of his works, and let despair gnaw at him." But even as they spoke, Saruman's malice stirred. At night, his voice would echo from the high windows, soft at first, then rising in bitter wrath. He cursed Gandalf, he cursed Theoden, he cursed the hobbits and the Ents. Wormtongue, creeping beside him, begged him to be still, but Saruman's pride was a fire that could not be quenched. One evening, as the Council of the Free Peoples debated their next move, A strange light glimmered in the water. Pippin, restless as ever, slipped away from the camp and wandered among the wreckage. His eyes, sharp with curiosity, caught the gleam. There, half hidden beneath a cloak, lay a smooth, dark sphere. It pulsed faintly, as if with inner fire. "What's this, then?" Pippin whispered, lifting it carefully. The moment his hands touched the stone, he felt a chill run through him, and the world seemed to tilt. A great eye opened in his mind, red and flaming, and a voice thundered, "Who are you?" Pippin cried out, dropping the stone in terror. The voice faded, but his heart hammered, and sweat poured from his brow. Before he could move, Gandalf's shadow loomed over him. "Fool of a Took," Gandalf said sharply, seizing the stone. "Do you not understand what this is?" The hobbit stammered, his face pale. I only wanted to look. I didn't know." "This is a palantir," Gandalf said grimly, wrapping it in his cloak. "A seeing stone of Númenor, one of the seven of old, and through it, Saruman has spoken with Sauron himself. You have drawn the eye upon you, Pippin. Pray that no harm comes of it." The company grew silent, the weight of the revelation sinking heavy. Saruman's betrayal was deeper than they had feared. He had not merely turned against the free peoples, but had become an open pawn of Mordor, bound by the gaze of the Dark Lord. Yet even in this grim hour, Gandalf saw a strange glimmer of fortune. "Perhaps," he murmured to himself, "this mischief will turn to good. For Sauron now believes the ring-bearer is captured, and his eye is turned elsewhere. We may yet use this against him." Thus the palantir of Orthanc passed into the keeping of Gandalf, its secret known, its danger contained, for the moment. But in the high tower, Saruman raged. He had lost his stone, lost his staff, lost his armies, and still the free peoples defied him. His betrayal was laid bare, his prison secure, yet his malice remained, festering, seeking always for some new path to strike. And so the watch upon Orthanc continued. The Ents stood guard. The riders kept watch, and the hobbits whispered to each other in awe and fear. The power of Saruman had been broken, but his shadow lingered still, clinging to the tower like a stain that no flood could wash away. The days that followed the breaking of Saruman's staff were heavy with tension. Orthanc loomed like a fang of black stone above the flooded ruin of Isengard, silent but not forgotten. Smoke no longer poured from its forges, yet the memory of fire lingered in the air. The Ents remained at their posts, unmoving sentinels. Their roots dug deep, their branches swayed gently in the wind, but their eyes never left the tower. The riders of Rohan pitched their tents nearby, though none liked to linger long in that place. The ground was soaked and foul, and the echo of Saruman's voice seemed to linger in the stones themselves. Men muttered uneasily, crossing themselves when they passed beneath the shadow of Orthanc. And still Saruman watched. At times he was seen pacing the high balconies, his robes gleaming pale as bone against the dark tower. At other times he vanished from sight, and a hush fell upon the vale as if the tower itself were listening. Grima Wormtongue crept about in the shadows like a pale ghost, fetching food or tending to his master's needs, though he shrank from the gaze of the Ents. Merry and Pippin, for their part, did their best to keep spirits high. They made a game of exploring the wreckage, climbing over broken walls, and boasting of their bravery in the storming of Isengard. They shared food and stories with the riders, and their cheer brought smiles even to weary faces. Yet when night came, and the wind moaned through the ruins. Both hobbits drew closer together, for the shadow of Orthanc filled their hearts with dread. One evening, as the sun set red behind the mountains, Gandalf gathered Theoden, Éomer, and Aragorn, who had come with Legolas and Gimli after the victory at Helm's Deep. They stood together beneath the walls of Orthanc, the waters lapping at their boots. "The time has come," Gandalf said gravely. "We must hear Saruman's voice and judge what is to be done with him. Though his power is broken, his tongue is still a weapon. Guard your hearts well." The company ascended the long stair to the foot of Orthanc. Treebeard accompanied them, his great form bending slightly as he peered upward. His deep voice rumbled, "Room, he will not come willingly, but he must be faced." Gandalf struck the base of the tower with the end of his staff, and the sound rang out like a bell. "Saruman," he called, his voice echoing, "come forth and speak with us." For a long moment there was silence. Then a figure appeared at a high window, white-robed and noble in bearing. His hair gleamed silver, and his face was stern, but his eyes were cold as ice. "Gandalf," he said smoothly, his voice carrying down like music, "so you return, triumphant and proud, with your rabble of horsemen and woodland creatures. What do you hope to gain by this farce? My works have been undone, yes, but not by your hand. It was the wrath of trees, not your wit, that brought Isengard low, and yet here you stand, puffed with pride, daring to call me to account." His words slid like oil, tempting the ear, and some of the riders shifted uneasily. Wormtongue crept to the window beside him, peering down with pale, fearful eyes, but Gandalf did not flinch. "Your pride has destroyed you, Saruman. You have betrayed your order, your allies, and your own wisdom. The free peoples will no longer endure your lies. Will you not come down and speak face to face as one humbled?" Saruman's lips curled. "Humbled? You think me humbled? No, Gandalf. You have always envied me, envied my power, my knowledge. Even now you wear the white that was mine by right. Do not speak to me of humility. I am Saruman of many colors, and no prison of trees will hold me forever." Theoden's voice rose clear and firm. "Your hand has brought death to my people, Saruman. Villages burned, children slain, my hall poisoned by your servant's tongue. What friendship I once gave you is ended. I name you foe of Rohan." Saruman laughed, though his eyes flashed with rage. "Foe? You are but a horse lord, clinging to scraps of land, while powers greater than you shape the world. When Mordor's shadow sweeps across your fields, you will beg for my aid, and I will not answer." Then Aragorn stepped forward, tall and stern, his hand upon the hilt of Andúril. "Your voice is but wind, Saruman. The age of lies is ending. The world has no place for your cunning now." For a moment, Saruman faltered. His gaze flicked from Aragorn's bright eyes to the sword that gleamed with the light of the west. But pride held him still, and he spat upon the stones. "You are all fools. Sauron will devour you, and I will laugh as the world burns." At last, Gandalf lifted his staff. His voice rang like thunder. "Saruman, your staff is broken, your seat of power lost. You are cast from the order of wizards. Be gone and trouble us no more." The words struck again with terrible force. Saruman staggered back, gripping the stone frame of the window. Wormtongue cowered, his face white with fear. For a heartbeat, all was silent. Then Wormtongue, in a frenzy of fear and malice, snatched something from within the tower and hurled it down. It spun through the air, a dark sphere gleaming with inner fire. It struck the steps with a crash, bouncing and rolling toward the company.
Startled, they leapt aside. The stone came to rest at Gandalf's feet. He bent swiftly and gathered it into his cloak, hiding it from view. But even as he touched it, he knew what it was. The Palantir of Orthanc. A cry of rage burst from Saruman above. "Fool, worm, what have you done?" His voice cracked with fury, and for the first time it trembled with despair. Wormtongue shrank back, whimpering, as Saruman vanished from sight. Gandalf held the stone close, his face grave. So this is how fortune turns. Saruman's greatest tool is now his undoing. But this is perilous. The stone is bound to Sauron, and through it he seeks to ensnare all who look within. We must guard it carefully. Theoden frowned. Then Saruman is left weaponless, yet still dangerous. Shall we not strike him down and end his threat forever? But Gandalf shook his head. No blade of man may harm him here, and Orthanc will not yield to us. He is broken, and his prison shall be his own pride. Leave him to his despair. Greater battles await us in the east. So they turned from Orthanc, leaving Saruman to his tower, his fury echoing faintly behind them. The Palantir was secured, though none yet knew what trials it would bring. The company set their eyes eastward, for Mordor's shadow grew, and Saruman's betrayal was but one piece in a greater war. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, Pippin glanced back once more at the Black Tower. He shivered, though the air was warm. "I don't like it," he whispered to Merry. "He's still in there watching. I can feel it." And Merry, though he tried to smile, could not deny it. Orthanc stood tall and silent, and within its walls the mind of Saruman still plotted, twisted, and restless, like a spider in its web. Orthanc was silent. The great tower rose, stark against the night sky, its black stone gleaming like glass under the pale light of the moon. No smoke rose now from Isengard. No sound of hammers or forges echoed from the valley. The waters of the river rushed steadily through the ruins, carrying away the last traces of Saruman's industry. But though the land was quiet, unease lingered. For everyone knew that Saruman still lived within the tower, a prisoner of his own pride, plotting in shadows that no Ent could pierce. The Ents kept faithful watch. Treebeard himself often paced the perimeter, his heavy feet leaving deep impressions in the softened earth. His eyes, slow and ancient, never wavered from Orthanc's windows. At night other Ents took turns, their great shapes standing silent as statues blending with the dark. No orc dared stir, no messenger crept out, and no ally came to free the prisoner. Still, the unease grew. Inside, Saruman was not idle. His voice no longer reached the world beyond the tower, but his mind was ever restless. He paced the stone floors like a caged lion, muttering to himself, rehearsing speeches that no one would hear. Wormtongue followed him like a shadow, fearful and resentful, fetching food, tending the fires, and listening to Saruman's endless tirades. "You think me finished, Grima?" Saruman would snarl, his eyes glittering. "You think the world has cast me aside? No! Even now Sauron's gaze sweeps across the plains. He will march soon, and then the lords of Rohan and Gondor will fall to their knees. They will beg me for counsel. They will remember that I was Saruman the Wise." But Wormtongue, though he trembled, sometimes muttered under his breath, "They will never beg you. They hate you. They left you here to rot." At those words, Saruman's wrath would rise like a storm. He struck Wormtongue with his hand or cursed him until the poor wretch cowered. Yet Wormtongue's bitterness only deepened, and he began to whisper to himself in the dark,
dreaming of the day he might slip a knife into his master's back. Meanwhile, beyond the ruined ring wall of Isengard, the free peoples moved on. Gandalf, Theoden, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and their companions departed, carrying the Palantir with them. Rohan turned its strength eastward, readying for the battles to come. The Ents remained behind, faithful guardians, but their wrath was spent. They had no more desire for war. Their task was only to keep Saruman caged. For Merry and Pippin, the days at Isengard were both strange and restful. They lingered for a short while with Treebeard, learning the songs of the Ents and walking under the vast boughs of Fangorn. They laughed and sang, but both felt a weight in their hearts whenever they looked back at Orthanc. Pippin especially could not shake the memory of the Palantir. At night he often dreamed of a red eye staring at him, vast and unblinking, and he would wake in a cold sweat. "Don't brood on it, Pip," Merry said one morning, as they sat beside a quiet stream, their feet in the water. "The stone is gone. Gandalf has it. You won't have to touch it again." Pippin forced a smile. "I know, but it felt alive, as if it knew me. I can't forget it." Indeed, though neither of them realized it fully, the Palantir had marked Pippin, and his part in the tale of the ring was far from ended. Back in Orthanc, Saruman raged at the loss of the stone. He knew Wormtongue had hurled it away in his madness, and he struck his servant many times in his fury. Yet his anger soon turned to despair. Without the Palantir, his vision was clouded. He no longer heard Sauron's voice, no longer glimpsed the armies of Mordor. He was cut off, his knowledge dwindling, his pride gnawed away by helplessness. Days turned to weeks. Saruman's robes grew tattered, his face haggard, though his eyes still gleamed with malice. Wormtongue grew thinner and more sullen, muttering constantly as he scurried about the tower. Sometimes he whispered curses at Saruman when his master's back was turned. "Worm," Saruman said one evening, his voice low and venomous, "you dream of betraying me. Do not think I do not see it. You live because I allow it. Cross me and you will die." But Wormtongue's eyes glinted with a spark of rebellion. He said nothing, but in his heart he longed for the day when Saruman's power was truly gone. Meanwhile, the world beyond Isengard was changing swiftly. News of Saruman's downfall spread like fire. Men marveled that the White Wizard had fallen so low, and hope grew in their hearts. Yet fear also spread, for if Saruman, wisest of the wise, had been corrupted, what hope did others have against the power of Sauron? Still, Saruman's betrayal had one lasting wound. Rohan lay in ruins, villages burned, families slain. Dunlendings roamed the borders, bitter and restless. The scars of Isengard's war would not fade quickly. Theoden's riders returned to rebuild, but all knew that greater war loomed in the east. And always Orthanc stood, dark and silent, its prisoner pacing within. Saruman had been stripped of power, but his malice remained. His voice was still sharp, his cunning still keen. Though the Ents watched him, they could not silence his schemes. In dreams and in whispers he plotted, waiting for any crack in his prison. Sometimes he would stand at the high window, staring eastward. His voice would drop to a whisper, and Wormtongue, crouched behind him, could barely hear. "You will rise, Lord of Mordor," Saruman murmured, "and when you come, you will burn them all. The horse lords, the Grey Fool, the forest walkers, burn them all and remember me." But the eye of Sauron no longer looked his way. Saruman had been cast aside, a pawn discarded. And in his tower, the fallen wizard began to taste the bitter fruit of betrayal.
that the master he had sought to serve, or master, no longer had need of him. Thus the days of Saruman in Orthanc stretched on, each one darker than the last. His betrayal of Isengard was complete, and now he sat in the ruin of his own making, gnawed by pride, hatred, and despair. Yet still his tale was not ended, for even broken and caged, Saruman's cunning remained dangerous, and his hand would yet reach out to bring sorrow to the free peoples before the end. Autumn came to the Westfold. The plains of Rohan turned golden, and the air grew crisp with the scent of harvest. Yet in the valley of Isengard, no season truly touched the land. Floodwater still pooled in the pits where forges had burned, and the ground was scarred by fire and iron. Only weeds began to creep along the stones, timid and pale. Above it all, Orthanc stood, dark and immovable, with Saruman still pacing its high chambers. The Ents had not forgotten their charge. Treebeard remained near, though his heart yearned for the deep woods of Fangorn. He often sighed as he gazed at the tower. Room. Watching a caged wolf is no work for an Ent. We are not made for such things. Still, Saruman is dangerous even without teeth. I will not let him slip away. Merry and Pippin had long since gone with Aragorn and the others, and the riders of Rohan had turned eastward to war. Isengard was quieter now. Only the Ents remained, slow and watchful, their roots digging into the soil as they kept guard. Saruman's voice was heard less often. He no longer thundered from the windows, but at night sometimes, Wormtongue's thin wailing carried faintly down, and the Ents shook their heads in sorrow. Inside, Saruman grew restless. His robes were ragged, his once bright hair hung lank, and his eyes were shadowed. He spent long hours gazing from the windows, muttering to himself. Wormtongue, gaunt and hollow-eyed, shrank under his master's gaze. "They have forgotten us," Wormtongue whispered one night, gnawing on a crust of bread. "No one comes. They have gone to fight their great war and left us here to starve. Better if we had fled before the gates closed." Saruman turned sharply, his voice cutting like a knife. "Fool, flee where? To whom? Do you think Rohan would welcome you back after your treachery? Or Gondor, perhaps? You would be hanged from their gates. No, Grima, we are bound together now whether you like it or not." But Saruman himself knew the truth. His hope was failing. The Palantir was lost to him, his armies destroyed, his power stripped away. He was no longer a master of fate, but a prisoner, and worse still, he could feel Sauron's gaze turned elsewhere. The Dark Lord no longer sought him, no longer needed him. He was discarded, a broken pawn. It was in those bleak days that a change came. Riders approached from the south, their banners bright in the autumn sun. The Ents rumbled uneasily, preparing to resist. But when the company drew near, the guards saw the white tree of Gondor upon their flags. At their head rode men of stern bearing, and with them was a messenger of the king. Treebeard met them at the ruined gates, his vast shape looming tall. "Whom? Little folk of stone and fire, why do you come to Orthanc? Saruman is caged, and we are watchful." The messenger bowed. "By order of King Aragorn Elessar, rightful heir of Gondor, the Tower of Orthanc is now claimed for the realm of men. Its prisoner shall be judged not by Ents nor by riders, but by the king himself. Stand aside, old one, for we have authority here." Treebeard sighed, his branches creaking. Room, kings and their commands. Very well. If Aragorn, son of Arathorn, claims it, then so it must be. But beware. Saruman is slippery as an eel and more poisonous.
So the guards of Gondor entered the valley. They climbed the long stair and called Saruman forth. And at last, after many months, the door of Orthanc opened. The figure who emerged was a shadow of the proud wizard he had once been. His robes hung in tatters, stained with dust and ash. His hair was gray, his face lined, and his back bent. Only his eyes burned with the old fire, sharp and bitter. Behind him crept Wormtongue, stooped and ragged, his face pale as parchment. Saruman looked upon the guards and gave a dry, bitter laugh. So, they send jailers to take me from one prison to another. Very well, I am weary of these walls. Lead me where you will find the chains cannot hold me, nor judgments bind me. Saruman of many colors is not so easily ended. But his words rang hollow. The guards saw only a broken old man, proud but powerless. They bound him not with chains, but with their stern watch, and led him away. Wormtongue stumbled after him, muttering curses under his breath. Treebeard watched them depart, his eyes full of sorrow. So ends my part in this tale, he said softly. Saruman's doom lies beyond my forest now. May the world deal with him as it must. For myself, I will return to my trees and try to heal the wounds he has made. And so the Ents turned back to Fangorn, leaving Isengard behind. The waters still flowed through the pits. The weeds still crept along the stones. In time the land would grow green again, but the Black Tower remained, silent and indestructible, a reminder of pride brought low. Saruman was led southward, past the fields of Rohan, past the hills where the last battles with his orcs had raged. Everywhere he looked, he saw the ruin of his plans. Burnt villages rebuilt, children laughing where once his Uruk-hai had marched, horsemen riding free across the plains. His lips curled in contempt, but in his heart bitterness gnawed. Look at them, Grima, he muttered as they trudged along. They think themselves free, they think they have won, but their doom is coming, greater than they can imagine. Mordor stirs, and when its armies march, all their little triumphs will be swept away. Then they will remember me, then they will regret. Wormtongue only hunched his shoulders and said nothing. Thus Saruman, once the White, was carried from his dark tower into the wider world again, not as a master but as a beggar. His betrayal of Isengard was complete, his power broken, yet still he clung to malice. For though his staff was shattered and his armies drowned, Saruman's voice and cunning remained. And in the shadow of that bitterness, a new treachery was already taking root. The road southward was long and weary. Saruman and Wormtongue, watched closely by Gondor's guards, traveled through the wide lands of Rohan and across the fens toward Gondor. Yet never did the prisoner seem grateful for his release from Orthanc. His lips curled in scorn, his tongue lashed like a whip, and his pride, though wounded, burned hotter than ever. To the guards he spoke in mockery. So this is the fate of the wise, dragged like a criminal at the heels of lesser men. Do you think Aragorn, your new king, will rule forever? He is a mortal like you, doomed to wither and die. You follow him now, but his line will fail, as all lines of men must. And when the darkness rises again, who will stand then? The men ignored him, though his words stung. Wormtongue followed in silence, eyes downcast, but his resentment deepened with each insult Saruman hurled, for often his master turned his bitterness upon him as well. Grima, Grima, Saruman sneered one night as they camped near the river. You are less than nothing. Without me, you would have starved long ago, and yet you scowl and mutter, dreaming of freedom. Do not think I do not see it. You are mine, Worm, mine to command until the end." Wormtongue's hands clenched, and for a moment his eyes flickered with murder. But he said nothing, and Saruman turned away, satisfied that his servant was still bound.
When at last they reached Gondor, Saruman was not brought in chains before Aragorn's throne, as he had feared. Instead, the king, wise in foresight, refused even to admit him to the White City. "His malice is broken," Aragorn said, "and his voice no longer commands as once it did. Let him wander as he will. The shadow has fled from him. His doom will find him, and it is not ours to hasten it." And so Saruman was set loose. No guards followed him, no chains bound him. He was a free man, yet never had he felt so powerless. His face grew gray, his robes hung in tatters, and Wormtongue shuffled after him like a beaten dog. Together they wandered northward, unwelcomed in villages, shunned by all who recognized them. Men spat when Saruman passed, and women turned their children away. Still Saruman's voice could weave its spells. In lonely inns and small hamlets he spoke softly, and some were swayed. A few poor folk gave him food or shelter, beguiled by his words of sorrow and wrongs done to him. But always in the end his bitterness showed through, and they cast him out. His pride was his cloak, and it kept him colder than rags. At last their wandering brought them to the Shire. Saruman, though ragged, smiled with cruel satisfaction. "Here is a land ripe for the plucking," he said to Wormtongue. "A soft people, fat and merry. While the great lords march in war, no one watches this corner. Here we may yet build a little kingdom of our own." And so began the final treachery. Saruman sent word to rough men from the south, vagabonds and outlaws, and drew them into the Shire. With his cunning, he set them as masters over the hobbits, turning the peaceful land into a place of fear. Trees were felled, inns were seized, and mills belched smoke where gardens had once grown. The hobbits, untrained in war, could do little against this sudden tyranny. Saruman named himself Sharky among them, a mockery of his former greatness. He strutted through Hobbiton, his voice sharp and scornful, and Wormtongue followed behind, silent and hated. But Saruman had not reckoned with the hobbits' courage, for Merry, Pippin, Sam, and Frodo returned from their great quest to find their home in chains. Though weary from long travels, their hearts burned with fury. They roused their kin, gathered what arms they could, and struck back. At the Battle of Bywater, the hobbits rose as one. Farmers, millers, and gardeners took up bows, staves, and slings. They drove the ruffians from their land, casting down Saruman's petty kingdom in a single day. Saruman fled to Bag End, but there he was cornered by the hobbits he had despised. Frodo, his heart still filled with pity, stood before him and said, "Go, Saruman, leave the Shire and trouble us no more. You have done enough harm." For a moment Saruman faltered. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, but his pride still gleamed. "So be it," he spat, "but do not think you have won. Even in your victory, you are small folk in a small land. The great powers of the world will crush you, as they will all who stand against them." He turned to leave, but Wormtongue, crouched at his side, had endured enough. Years of scorn, years of blows and curses had filled him with poison. With a sudden cry, he leapt upon Saruman and drew a knife. "You have kept me as your slave!" Wormtongue screamed, his voice breaking, but no more. Before any could stop him, Wormtongue struck, driving the blade into Saruman's back. The wizard staggered, a cry of shock and fury escaping his lips.
He fell upon the steps of Bag End, clutching at the wound. In that moment, his spirit seemed to rise, pale and terrible, like a shadow loosed from flesh. For an instant, it towered above them, a figure of light and malice, but a cold wind blew from the west, and the spirit was swept away, fading into nothingness. Saruman the White, once the greatest of the Istari, was gone. Wormtongue stood trembling, the knife bloody in his hand. Arrows whistled and hobbits shot him down where he stood. He fell beside his master, and so ended their twisted bond, servant and lord alike. Silence fell over Hobbiton. The hobbits looked upon the bodies with awe and sorrow. Frodo bowed his head. Even he was not beyond pity, he said softly, but his own pride destroyed him. And so the betrayal of Isengard was finished. Saruman, who had sought to rival Sauron, who had dreamed of ruling with the power of the ring, ended not in triumph but in squalor, slain in a land he had thought beneath his notice. His tower still stood in the west, indestructible stone against the sky, but its master was gone forever. The hobbits set their hands to healing, and the Shire blossomed again. The scars of Sharky's rule faded, replaced with new gardens, new trees, and new hope. And in tales told by firelight, Saruman's name became a warning that pride, when turned to betrayal, can bring even the mightiest to ruin.